Hey, and we are back here at Microsoft Virtual Academy. We're still talking with Daniel Roth. This is part 2.
Part 2. We're moving on to Mvc 6.
Yes, so if you missed part 1, stop everything, go back, watch part 1, get a little context, and then return. We're talking about ASP.NET 5. Where did you leave us?
So we figured out how to get the tooling and how to make our way around the project system, what all the folders mean, the new files. We started building some web applications, adding some middleware to the new HTTP request pipeline. But now we actually want to use, an application framework. Let's use some MVC. Let's build some web UI, but also web APIs with the same framework. That's what we're going to do.
All right, cool.
All right, so this is about Mvc 6, and Mvc 6 is, you're familiar with MVC. It's model view controller. It's got razor views and controllers, but MVC 6 actually does so much more than it did before. It is a single aligned web stack on top of ASP.NET 5 for doing both your web UI and your web APIs. That's the idea, is to have a single aligned framework. So what we're going to do is we'll do an overview of Mvc 6. We'll then talk about using Mvc 6 to do your UI concerns and what's different with doing UI in Mvc 6 versus MVC 5. And that's going to trip me up, I guess. And then after that, we'll talk about building web APIs, having content negotiation and JSON and XML data and those type of things.
All right, cool.
So first, let's talk about Mvc 6. So the world today, like if we look at MVC, Web API, web pages, they're actually they're kind of like silos. They're 3 separate technologies, and they don't really share very much. Web pages and MVC, they do actually share a common view format. They share Razor as the syntax that you use to write your views. But beyond that, they don't share anything else. Like their HTML helpers, for example, are completely different. MVC and Web API, they look very similar. They both have notions of controllers and actions and filters and model binding and dependency resolution and so forth, but they actually share zero code. They have no code sharing at all. And there's history behind that about why that is. We wanted Web API to work outside of IIS, outside of the ASP.NET pipeline. So it couldn't have a system web dependency at all, because there's no system web when you're running outside of IIS. Whereas MVC came previously, it had already been built, it already had that system web dependency. That meant that Web API could not depend on MVCs. But we wanted it to feel familiar. We wanted the concepts to be things that you know, and so a lot of the concepts were essentially duplicated. You have filters in Web API and filters in MVC. The interface looks very, very similar, but you can't use them with each other. Now we'd like to fix this world, to get this world to a place where these guys share a lot more, because there's a lot of duplication in terms of concepts and in terms of code, and removing that duplication is good. It's good for you because it means that it's less confusing. Things that you learn, you can just keep reusing them across your applications and your scenarios, and it's also good for us because it means we have less duplicated code, so we can ship more features, which is again good for you. So that's what we're doing, and MVC 6 is that aligned stack. It is literally the next version of MVC and the next version of Web API and the next version of web pages, all wrapped in one package.
So making one ASP.NET really happen.
Yes, well, yeah, from a binary technical perspective, absolutely. So it's pretty cool. So you can do all your web API and web UI concerns within one framework. Now, how do you get started with MVC 6? So first what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to install the package. We saw that before. Installing packages, you go to your project JSON, or you can use the NuGet package manager to add Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC. It's the same package as MVC has always been. It's just been revved to new version 6.0.0. Okay, then you're going to go to your startup.cs file, and you're going to need to do 2 things. You're going to need to add MVC as part of your request pipeline. Like there's middleware involved here so that MVC can then handle requests. You're also going to want to add MVC's services to the dependency injection abstraction in ASP.NET 5. There's a new one. Okay. And it's a common one that we use across the board in ASP.NET 5. There's actually a small, lightweight IOC container that we use to bootstrap the system. It's not I mean, it's a very simple one. We expect that if you want to replace it with AutoFac or Ninject or your favorite IOC container, no problem. Absolutely, you can do that. If that's not something you're interested in, then you can just use the one that's there, and it will get the system going. But all the frameworks that we're building on ASP.NET 5, they reuse this same dependency injection abstraction. That means we no longer have a dependency resolver for MVC and a dependency resolver for Web API, and they're completely different. And you have to get the separate adapters for your IOC container to make those two guys work with the same container. Don't need to do that anymore because there's just one abstraction that everybody is leveraging. And that includes SignalR, the Entity Framework guys, across the board. One DI abstraction.
So looking at this here, you say in your configure method, say app.useMVC. We saw the configure method in part 1, and that makes sense to me.
Right.
Configure services and all that, that's all new.
We haven't seen that yet.
We haven't.
What is that? That is the entry point where you configure your services for your application. And we'll show you that in a second. It's just literally a method called configure services that takes the iService collection. Okay. And then you add services. You use middleware, you add services.
Okay.
Those are the verbs.
Yeah, I'm going to need to see that.
Okay. Or you can just create a new starter web app, and MVC is already wired up in there, and then you don't have to do anything because MVC is ready to go.
Oh, okay. Now,
if you need samples, tutorials beyond what I'm able to present here, you can find all those in the MVC repo on our GitHub organization, ASP.NET/MVC under github.com. You can find a bunch of samples there.
Okay.
All right, so let's get started with MVC 6. What does that look like, and how do we get hooked up to this new dependency injection system? All right, let's look at this project. So I've already created this MVC 6 demo project, and I've already done some of these steps. Let's take a look at them. So first of all, we need that package. So I've gone ahead and I added the ASP.NET MVC package to my project.json file. And that should show up then under my references node, and it does. And again, I can drill through here and see all the things that MVC depends on if that's something you're interested in. It depends on Razor and so forth. All right, so I've got the package now. Now I just need to use the middleware. I need to actually add it to my request pipeline. And it's not, MVC itself is not actually middleware, but it sits on top of routing middleware. Like if you're familiar with ASP.NET today, you maybe have used ASP.NET routing, which is like a module that sits in the ASP.NET pipeline. And it deals with taking a request and parsing its URI and extracting some values from it and then figuring out which route handler should then handle that request. And MVC leveraged that heavily in all prior versions. Well, we're now in a new request pipeline, so we needed new routing middleware. And that's what MVC sits on top of. And it's basically a route handler for the new routing middleware that's in ASP.NET 5. So how do we add that thing? Let's take a look. In our startup.cs, we have our configure method that we saw last time, and we just app.useMVC. Mm-hmm. And inside this extension method, it is adding the route middleware, which you could use as a generic component. We didn't see that last time, but you can, if you want to do like just raw routing, you could do that. And then it adds MVC as the default handler for the route middleware. It also adds some default routes. Like you may say, well, where's my normal default MVC route that I know and love? Curly brace controller, curly brace action, curly brace ID. Well, it's there. It's just being added by default. If you want to add it explicitly, you can do that. So here's where how you can get access to the route table right here in line when you say use MVC. And then you can just say routes.
And that's the right and primary place to do that, to add new routes.
Yeah, this is where you would add routes, right directly in here in line. Mm-hmm. And then let's see, let's give it a name. Usually it's called, I think, default, right? In fact, let's do it properly. I think it's a route. Oh, I think I need to resolve this. Let's get some.
I didn't get the
Intellisense.
Map route was there.
Quick shot. Using Microsoft, not MVC, I think is what I'm going to need. We got some Intellisense now. Mm-hmm.
When that's gray in the using there, what does that mean?
It means it's not being used. Is it routing? I don't know. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the namespace for. We got it now. There, yeah, okay. So it's in the routing namespace. All right.
Okay.
Usually, I think VS has
control comma is supposed to bring that in.
Yeah, was it control comma? Maybe it's extension method in Intellisense is supposed to be like.
Yeah, control dot.
Okay. So anyway, it's name. Let's give it a name. Default.
Okay.
That's just the name of the route that you can use for referencing when you want to do like link generation. Mm-hmm. And then template. This is the normal template, right? It's a controller. Now, normally, when you do this, you would say controller action ID, then you would create this anonymous object to define default values for things. And unless you've done this like 100 times, it's kind of tricky to do yourself. But new in ASP.NET 5, the routing middleware actually supports default values right in line. This is a syntax that was introduced actually with attribute routing in MVC 5 and Web API 2, and now we've actually just brought it into the routing middleware. You can do it right here. So if I want to say my default controller is home, just say equals home. That's pretty nice. And then if I want to say my default action is index, let's do that. And then similarly, you can also define optional values in line. You don't have to go use that marker value in like you did in ASP.NET 5. You can just say ID question mark, and that says this ID value is optional. And that looks good. So there's that default browser.
And this is, when we say use MVC, we're talking about MVC, which includes what we thought of as MVC and Web API. And these routes are shared as well?
Yeah. Well, you can use this route. This route is more of an MVC style route. By default, we also add attribute routing into the system, and it's just there. You don't have to explicitly add it. We think that mostly for web APIs, you're going to be using attribute routing because that's where you really want to have control over your UI space, so that clients have something nice that they can call into.
I see.
So yeah, so this would be more for the like your getting started with controllers and actions in like forum posts, that type of stuff. All right, so that's there's our route. We also need to add the MVC services. So this is a new method, and this is a special method. It has by convention, it's called configure services, and it takes as a parameter a iService collection. And this service collection is where you're going to do all your configuration for the services that you want to make available to everyone in the system.
And what is the difference between services and middleware?
So middleware sit in the HTTP request pipeline, right? So you have an HTTP request comes in, and there's a piece of middleware that can handle it, or it can hand it to the next guy, or another piece of middleware or hand it to the next guy. And someone eventually handles it and turns it into a response, and it flows back down through the middleware, and out it goes, right? Now, each of those middleware and all the other components in the system probably need different sets of logic, like, I don't know, the DB context, for example, or getting access to a logger service of some sort. Those are services that are useful in the system, and it's convenient, we found, a very common pattern to use dependency injection to make them available to all the different middleware and components in the system. So that way they just say, I need an iLogger factory. Or I need the DB context, please give me one. And then the dependency injection system just handles injecting it into that component. So that's what you're configuring here, is a set of services that you want to make available throughout your application.
So when you're thinking IOC and dependency injection, you think services in this context. That's where you go looking for those things.
Yeah, and that's where you do in this method, in configure services.
All right.
So MVC has a bunch of services that MVC itself expects to get injected. And it needs to make those available through the dependency injection system. So that's what add MVC is doing. So all the default services that MVC uses, you add here by just saying add MVC. You can also do configuration here of the MVC options, like how you want it to do certain things. And you do that by saying services.configure. And there's a pattern in ASP.NET 5, we call it the options pattern, where you create an options object, and then you make those options available, again, as a service. So that anyone that needs those options can just get them injected, use them, and use them to configure themselves in the system. So MVC has defined a bunch of options. That's my start screen, everyone. No. There we go. Took a little second for it to resolve.
There you go.
All right, so here's some options. So configure, and then the options type that MVC uses. And then when I want to do something with those options, I get a lambda again that I can use to access the options. And if we look on the MVC options, this is where you will find things like, I want to configure global filters. Or I want to configure formatters, like in Web API, you had formatters. Or I want to configure my model binders. All those common concepts that you would, in the past, normally have like some static that you would, like global filters or global this, that, in MVC 5. Here, it's done through a dependency injection system. So it's, again, more testable, less dependency on statics. If you want to configure anything globally, you do it inside this options pattern. All right, I don't have anything I want to configure, but if I did, configure MVC options here. That's where I would do it. Okay.
Is that part of the larger generic configuration system?
It's certainly part of it. Like there's the configuration system. We can talk about that. Let's set up configuration real fast. So with configuration, there's just a configuration object. It's a very simple pattern. It's just a way to get named values from a set of config sources like XML.
And before, with ASP.NET, there was angle brackets and web configs and configuration sections. And if you wanted to do something, a lot of people just wrote their own. They're like, I want to get it from this text file or that environment variable. But now it seems like we've made it very flexible, where you can put configuration wherever you want.
Yep. Let me actually show you some of the convenient places we provide by default. I'm going to add another package to get configuration. It's under Microsoft Framework configuration. And then there's the core configuration model. And then I'm going to pull in the JSON package, which would pull in a JSON provider. And then there's the version. Let's kick off a package restore so we get the package. OK, so you just create a config object. And there's your configuration object. Configuration needs apparently a namespace. There it is. And let's look at what this guy's got on it. This is the core interface here for configuration. And you'll see it's got get and just takes a key.
Yeah.
So get me a value. It does also have a notion of setting a value and committing it. So you can actually even save the configuration data back to the configuration sources. But it's basically just a simple way to get named values. And then you can configure a set of providers that it uses to find where those values are at. For example, I don't know, let's say you want to get add provider.
So when Hunter was talking about being cloud ready, the intent would be to make it so we could easily pull stuff out of Azure configuration if we're in an Azure website or out of an environment variable or whatever.
Yeah, so for like if you're in an Azure website, so let's say like locally during development, I'm going to do like I don't know, like config.json file.
Right.
I'm just going to have a chunk of JSON that I set locally that I can.
Quote whatever .json.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if I want to do something that works better in a different environment, like in Azure, that might be convenient to do with add environment variables. Because Azure has this nice feature, right, where you can say add app settings in the portal. And they're just basically environment variables. And when you deploy your application into that environment, then you can just pick up the right configuration settings from the environment. And things just work. And that allows you to avoid all the complexities around like config transforms, where you have a local web.config, but then you munge it before you deploy so that when it gets there, it has the right values. You can avoid that type of complexity by just saying, you know what, get the values from the environment where I'm at, because the right values are already there. That's the key idea. So this is a simple way to do it. I've added two providers here, one for a JSON file, one for environment variables. The way to think about them is they're basically stomping on each other. So like I added the values from the JSON file, and then I add the values from
scoping. It's layers of scoping.
It's precedence in some sense.
Precedence,
So I would see the environment variables if they were there with a higher precedence than the JSON values.
Right.
So that's how you would add configuration to your system.
Cool. Thank you.
You can pass this guy around. You can then use it to populate like options objects that you make available as services to your components. And there's infrastructure for doing that. Probably a topic for a more advanced session. All right, but that's configuration.
Okay.
We've got MVC. We've got some config. Let's run it. So I've got set up just a simple little home controller here. Nothing fancy. It's got a
derives from controller.
Derives from controller. Yeah. I've also set up a little web API controller here.
Also derives from controller.
We'll get from that. Yeah, because it's one system. There's just one controller. And then for views, we have a little home index view. It's rendering a form and printing out home page. Let's see if this actually does anything. Does this work? So we'll run it. Pull up a page. This should go to an error.
So you have no config file.
I have no JSON config.json file. So let's just comment that out. You may see a config.json file in the starter web template, and that's because there is one there. And it gets added in startup to the config object. All right, great. So we've got localhost. Like a submit button looks like my editor 4 template isn't quite working, but we'll fix that in a second. But this is an MVC view that's being rendered from MVC and sitting on top of ASP.NET 5. And this can run both inside of IIS, outside of IIS. You can use the same trick that we showed before where you set up a web command and run it from your own process. You can do that with MVC 6 and you're good to go. Just to show like a more full-fledged application, like here's the starter web. This has all the bells and whistles, right? This has a Bootstrap enabled, and it has jQuery, and it's got an ASP.NET identity set up, so you can log in. This is a fully functioning MVC 6 application running on top of ASP.NET 5. Just for comparison, slightly prettier than my little job here. Okay, well let's take a look at what's new in MVC 6 next. Like let's understand how do I do UI development with MVC 6? How can I leverage some of these dependency injection features? And then we'll talk about Web API afterwards.
Okay.
So next, we'll talk about Web UI. And what's different? Is it different to build Web UI in MVC 6?
Well, because a lot of people are going to ask themselves, how hard is it going to be for me to move my MVC 5 stuff to MVC 6?
Yeah. Well, the good news is not much is different. Like it's basically the same. Like you see, it's a controller and it has actions and it returns action results. And you use that. There are some things that are different, and the places where it's different is where before it was touching like system web, like it was using ASP.NET routing. Well, now you're using middleware routing in ASP.NET 5. Those places will be different. Any place where you touched like HTTP context, well, you're going to be using the ASP.NET 5 context instead of the pre-existing ASP.NET context. But other than that, most of your code is actually should just compile as is untouched. If you go pick up an MVC 5 book and you're trying to learn how to code in ASP.NET MVC, you'll find that the concepts directly apply because that's very intentional. It is literally intended to be the same framework that just was ported to work on top of the new ASP.NET 5 runtime. As a sort of a case in point, we had an intern. Now, granted, our interns are very smart. We have very good interns, but we literally did give her an MVC 5 textbook and said, "Here, go learn MVC 6," and she was able to work with MVC 6 just fine using that content. So that's good news. Like the things that you got razor views, you got actions, the conventions about how the views are discovered, all the HTML helpers. It's all the same. None of that's really changed.
So it's cliche, but the term concept compatible really is legit.
Yeah.
It makes total sense.
The places where you'll end up doing migration are more around where it ends up touching the ASP.NET 5 runtime. There you'll have to do some code migration, but your controllers and actions, those should be mostly unchanged. Now, there are some things that are different, though, that you can take advantage of. Like one of the big things that's different in MVC 6 is this use of dependency injection throughout the system. And let me try and show you a little bit about what I mean. So we saw the home controller, and this was working, but it derived from controller, and that seemed normal, and that was sort of what made a controller in MVC 5, right?
Right.
In MVC 6, that's not actually the case. Like I'm going to delete this. Let's just
No base class.
No base class. What's really making this a controller in MVC 6 is the fact that it just ends in controller. Now, I lost some of my nice helper methods. Like that Big C controller in MVC 6 is really about making some things easier for you, like wrapping some of the action results in little helper methods, making services, doing the dependency injection for you up front so you don't have to worry about it. But you don't have to do any of those things. So like
how would you get view back?
Let's get some content back first. So let me return a new let's just return a new content result. I can just new one of these up. And let's give it some content like, okay, MVC still working.
So it is literally that the name of it ends in controller that makes it a controller?
And I'm gonna, yeah. And let's comment this whole thing out. Okay, let's go here and run this again. We should still hit that action. So it's still working. Like it got to that controller.
Yeah, routing's still there. Everything's the same.
How can that be? It's just we call these POCO controllers. Like a controller in MVC is literally just a type that happens to end in the name controller.
Plain old CLR object.
Now, if we go look at controller and what it's doing, like it has those helper methods and it also is injecting services. Like let me add it back just so I can go F12 it real quick. Let's look at what's on controller. Like one thing you'll notice, it has an action context property. That's the context for to call the action that was selected. And if we look at that guy, it's got this interesting activate attribute on it. And that's because controllers in MVC are type activated using the DI system. And the action context is injected into the controller so that it's available to you. And you can do that as well. Like it's nothing special about Big C controller that it has an action context and it's using activate. You can do that on your own type. So let me show you an example. Like let me add a property here. Let's put activate on it. So public was action context, right? Yeah, and let's call it action context. Okay, so there's my action context. And what did that? Oh yeah, then we gotta get rid of the base class. Save
I
it.
see. So you're saying I want one, and this will then do public property level dependency injection.
Yeah.
It will inject an action context into that.
Just by default. And you, of course, can replace the system with your own IOC container and use your own patterns. But by default, you'll just get something that works. And you said you wanted the view back, right? So
right.
let's return the view. So that was a view result. All that view method does is create the view result and return it for you. Now, we're not returning content anymore. We actually want a view. So let's see, what do I got to do? I have a view name, right? Now,
Right.
I could just say here, like, well, I want the index view. Well, that's kind of, not very satisfying, right? Because that's the name of the method. I kind of want that just to work. So I can instead, let's get that action context, which has the action descriptor on it, and get the name of the action descriptor. And that's the name of the action that was actually called. So this is semantically equivalent to what was happening before. And let's see. I should now go back and I should see my rendered submit button view.
Dun, dun, dun.
There it is. Okay, so that's POCO controllers. You can inject services onto your type. You don't need to use Big C controller. You can, and it's convenient, but you don't have to. Same thing with web APIs, whether you're doing web APIs or web UI. And this is sort of a theme. Like a lot of what's new in MVC is that you can use injection, dependency injection, all over the place. Like let's say you have a model. Like let me go back here. Let's look at this create method. Let's uncomment this again. So this is a method that's a post now, right? Actually, maybe I should put a post thing on it.
Right. Someone's filled something out, hit submit.
Hit submit.
Form posted the to-do item.
And I actually need to make my editor for to-do item. Oh, this is supposed to be, no, that's right? Isn't that right? Let me move it up. Maybe it's not high enough in the page. Okay, let's see if I can get I want to see my form so I can really submit something. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to do it with Fiddler.
So you're trying to, when you said editor for model, you're hoping to have it look at to-do item and give you some text boxes and stuff.
Yeah.
Which it ordinarily does.
It ordinarily does. What do I do? Oh, maybe I need this @ sign here. I seem to recall that I need the @ sign. If the users online are seeing the error before I get to it, feel free to chime in.
It's live.
There it is. I was missing the @ sign.
We are live.
I'm not a human razor parser.
Still.
Okay,
Nice
so I've got
nice
a form,
recovery.
and if I want to actually start debugging now. I'm gonna put a breakpoint on the controller,
Okay.
and it looks like I need to put my Big C controller back so I can actually return view. It's convenient to do that.
Yeah, indeed.
And let's turn this back one as well. This is return view.
Just
And that's all that view helper
it did.
method was doing was the same code that you saw before. Okay, and let's go in.
You can get rid of your action context because that one hides the other one.
Oh yeah. Okay, and
All right.
so let's post something. Let's run this under the debugger.
Is this the same app?
Did I hit the wrong one? Let's debug the correct one.
Okay. So we're going to post some data from here and break, hopefully right there on that controller.
So 1, 2, 3, and I don't know, like a haircut. Submit.
Did you debug?
I think I did.
Are you posting to the right location?
It doesn't appear to be. No. Let me go back here. There was my action, submit, home, create.
Check your source code.
So this would go back. That's home create is right here. Maybe my action. Let's see. Let's just do.
What's your source?
Huh? The source of
the just look at the source of the result right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Form action. Action is null.
Action is null. This should come from the same. Using.
It was like begin form didn't work.
Yeah. Using the form. Am I missing a paren?
You can just hard code it for now. This is a daily build of a daily build.
Like this?
I was thinking just actually hard code the entire form.
The entire form.
/home/create.
Like so?
That's what I'm thinking.
All right, we'll get this.
We shall see.
Where's my...
Pressure's on. We're living on the edge here, though, because we're using dailies and we're bringing down dailies.
I have a working version of it. I bet if I dipped it, I would recognize what I'm doing wrong.
Of course.
Got an extra semicolon.
That's always fun. All right.
44 not found.
/home/create. Capital. Capital letters?
No.
You sure?
Routing something or other. Should be... Did I get this right?
Was it because we changed our routes?
Maybe.
Use the default route?
Let me try. Who's this guy?
Sometimes people will look at this and they'll say, oh, this isn't working. What's going on? It's chaos. These guys don't know what they're doing. But at the same time, when you have little errors like this and things go wrong, you learn more. And hopefully you'll learn along with us as we figure out what's going on.
Let me switch to
Do me a
another
favor.
project. I got another project that.
May I make an observation?
Yeah.
You're doing a get rather than a post. So change your method on your hard-coded form. So there you go. There you go. Just a thought.
I think Big Get Form though does that for you, doesn't it?
I noticed that it was putting the details of your form in your URL, which makes it a get. There you go.
We got it. Whew, man. Okay. Great. So we got a to-do item.
Let's see if it actually bound us data.
So we bound some data. So that's normal. That was actually just getting normal MVC to work. So we got MVC working. That's good. That's good.
Sure.
So let's continue this. Now, what I want to do though is like sometimes you want to bind some other interesting stuff from the request, and maybe you actually want to do it on the model type.
Well, and just to be clear, to hover over to do there to make sure people understand what we're talking about is that we sucked out of the form post the values and reconstituted a to-do item, right? That's
right.
Model binding.
We took those fields from the form and model binding, figured out how to construct an object out of that. There's a bunch of value providers that took the named values and constructed an object. And that's one of the big value props of MVC is that nice rich binding from like form posts to strongly typed objects.
You're saying you can model bind from lots of other places.
We can bind all sorts of things now. Shall we see that? Let's take a look. So let me go to my, I'm going to stop debugging, and I'm going to go back to this to-do item type. I'm going to add some other stuff. Like, let's say I want to add a header value here.
Okay.
Like string Dan's header. So there are a set of from attributes that you can use. If you're familiar with Web API, this idea of a from attribute is not too unusual. Like you had from URI and from body were concepts in Web API. Those concepts are like from body, for example, is a concept in Mvc 6 now. That's a way to say I'd like to bind data from the body, like from JSON XML. We'll get to that in a second when we talk about Web APIs. But you can also say I want a from header. And you can put this right on a property in your model type. And this will, now your model type is more than just the form.
From an HTTP header?
Yeah, an HTTP header.
And is that safe? Could someone put something naughty in there?
Well, it's the full request. Like there's a bunch of stuff in the request, and the stuff could come from the forum post. It could come from some JavaScript stuck a header on there, and it's as safe as the source of the original request. I mean, it's the same request coming from the same place. So just like you're binding stuff from your forum post, binding to a header. Same
and weren't there rules about like excluding or including and being very explicit about where it comes from?
Yeah, so that's just that when you're defining your model types, you want to make sure that the set of things that you're exposing on your model types are things that you're okay with being accessible on the wire. Because the model binders will happily bind things by name to things here, and they'll serialize them out. So if you like have an entity from your database and it has like salary or is admin or stuff like that, and those weren't values you intended to put on the wire, you probably shouldn't use them as your model types that you're.
So that's why you have that view model separation, and you'd have view model in and view model out.
That's right. That's right.
I see.
Okay, let's see if we can get this to work. So I've added a header, and by convention it'll just be the name, just like everything else in model binding is done by name.
Okay.
Now to set a header, that's a little bit more work. So what I'm going to do is let's start the debugger again, and I'm going to pop up my favorite tool. I'm just Fiddler. If I can spell it right. There it is.
Okay.
All right, and let's construct a request. So post. And we want to go to that URI. What's the
slash
URI?
home slash.
We need this thing.
Yeah, slash home slash create.
Yeah. And we'll go to. Oh, and I just made my request method very interesting.
There we go.
All right, slash home slash create. And we don't need any except header. Host is fine. And let's say the content type is going to be form encoded data. So application form URL encoded. And then let's add a custom header. Dan's header. Ta-da. Okay, and then let's add some data in here, like what was it, like ID. Equal 1, 2, 3, and title equals test. Okay.
All right.
Execute. Looks like VS got hit a breakpoint. And if we go look in this to-do type, hopefully we see ta-da.
So then you've got model binding from the HTTP header of the post.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Similar if I put like from body on that model type, then that would mean that property would be bound using formatters like from JSON or XML.
And I assume that also, given all of this dependency injection, you could say something like maybe from service.
From services, I think is the.
From services.
Is it from service or from services? From services.
There's some. Okay,
cool. So then you could put like iLogger factory here or some service that you're using and just inject.
And do all of these model binding things work with Web API within?
Everything's the same.
It's all the same.
Absolutely
really
the same. Yeah.
So go back to that home controller then. So then arguably, there's nothing about that says it's MVC or it's Web API other than the fact that it returns a view. I mean, if I return a JSON, it's the same thing.
That's right.
It's all very RESTful.
If you wanted from the same controller to have actions that are returning JSON and XML RESTfully and other actions that are returning views, that's totally doable. You can do that. If you prefer to keep them separate in separate controllers, that's fine as well. But the good news is that both controllers are sitting on top of exactly the same request pipeline. They use exactly the same filters. They'll use the exactly the same model binders. They'll use all the same infrastructure under the covers is the same. So you can reuse those components now, whereas you couldn't before.
Okay.
So let's talk actually a little bit about Web API. So Web APIs, I have a Web API controller here, so you can do things like return an object, and that object will get formatted with the configured set of formatters. And just like in Web API, we have a formatter for JSON and XML. And we'll respond to the accept header using content negotiation to determine what gets serialized back. So we can hit this to-do controller real fast.
Okay.
You'll also notice that this controller is using attribute routing to determine its URI space. So I can set a base route on the controller, which in this case is just the name of the resource, to-dos.
Okay.
And then I can set the routes for each of the actions. And you'll notice that we allow you now to merge the verb and the route into a single attribute. Like before, you had to have use a route attribute and specify the verb separately. It was HTTP
Right.
get and then route, whatever the route was. They're now merged into one single attribute. We did that because we observed that most other frameworks, they tend to couple the verb
Right.
and the route together as one nice concept.
So looking at this code, I'm guessing just kind of intuitively that I'd say /to-do / a number, and it would constrain that to an integer for me automatically.
Yep.
It's very intuitive, and I don't have a routing table I have to worry about.
Yeah, let's see if we can actually get something. To do that, I'm actually going to
You could use a
use Chrome because
non-threatening competitive browser.
Yeah, non-threatening competitive browser. Mostly because Chrome sends an accept header with that says accepts XML,
Yeah.
which is nice to be able to render. So if I run this, what was it? To-dos, right?
Yep.
That should work. Do I get some?
/ID.
Oh yeah, thanks. And it has to be an integer, right?
Yep.
/ID would be 123, and there's some XML.
There you go.
If I do ABC, I should get that nasty page again.
So
it's working.
And because you're not putting in all the different error messages and stuff, because you have to opt into the middleware, you get a
very basic
error
experience.
message. Yeah.
In that case, it was actually routing that was failing. There wasn't really an error. It was just like, well, there's no endpoint here.
Right. Okay.
So
Because the routing said only accept this non-greedy route, this very specific route.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. That makes sense.
Now, one cool thing that's new in the way attribute routing works in Mvc 6 is it's kind of annoying that you have to repeat the name of the controller here. Like often you want the base route of the controller to just be the name of the controller.
Right.
So we have this new idea of they're called route tokens. They're special tokens that can be replaced by the system. And they're square brackets. So square brackets and square brackets. Look a little crazy, I know, but in the route, if you put square brackets, this is something that will be replaced by the system. So like if I say controller here,
I see.
and if I refactor my controller name, it will just automatically pick up the name of the controller. There's also one for action. Like if you put action in there, you could, if you were using like attribute routing in MVC, it would just put the name of the action inside the route. Like if you wanted to reroute an action.
So what are the curly braces then?
So curly braces are things that you're going to extract from the request URI.
Okay.
Brackets are things that you want the system to, to put into the route template for you, to fill in this gap with me for me for the name of the controller. So route values are things you're extracting. Route tokens are things you're going to put into the route template for you.
And is there just controller in action for square
I
braces?
think there may also be area. I think area may also be supported as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. So if we save this, run it. We wanted our impartial third-party browser. This should still work, and it looks like it did. So
Yeah.
we got the same idea.
All right.
All right, so that's attribute routing in Web API. We saw that, content negotiation was actually working. It's returning a XML when I asked for XML,
Right.
return object. So I'm doing Web API and Web UI from the same framework. That's Mvc 6. I'm trying to think if there was one other thing.
What is produces?
Oh, produces. Yeah, let's talk about produces. So currently, it's just saying I'm going to return XML
Right.
if you ask for it, and Chrome did ask for it. But what if, sometimes I want to just return one format. Like
Right.
I don't want to
Just JSON
let
for
the
everybody.
client dictate. Like I just want it to be JSON in
Yeah,
my
yeah.
case, for example, or I only want it to be one of these formats, not all the formats that I've configured in my formatters, just maybe a subset of them. That type of
Right.
We can do that. So there's this new attribute called produces.
Is that method level, or is that
Method level, yeah.
Can you say to the controller level? Just say this whole controller produces.
That'd
be nice.
That may work. I haven't
Feature
tried
request.
it. Let me tell you. Yeah, experiment for home. Does produces work on the
Yes,
controller?
an exercise to the reader.
It should. So let's say I only want to produce application JSON.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now if I go back to here, I saved it,
Yeah.
and we refresh here. We're spinning. We get JSON.
And you didn't have to build. Again, just a reminder.
Yeah.
Even with your web APIs, it's just refresh, make a change, hit save, and refresh.
Now, I didn't change the accept header that Chrome sends. Like, Chrome still said, if you have XML, please give me XML.
Yep.
But the service author said, I don't care if they ask for XML. I really want to produce JSON. So this is nice if you want to keep that method signature that returns a strongly typed object, but you want to limit the set of formats that it's actually producing.
And I have total control. Like if I wanted to say 123.json does JSON and .xml does XML, any kind of thing I could imagine that within the RESTful scope, I could do any of this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, those you could do route yourself, The dot and the media type sort of shortened, shorthand format. That's something that in the Web API we handled with what were called media type mappings. MVC 6, that concept actually isn't there as a first-class citizen yet, but it's one of the features that it's on our backlog is actually to have that like .xml, .json shorthands. It's kind of nice when within the browser where you only have a get verb.
Very cool. All right, well, we're going to come back in a few minutes, take a little bit of a meal break here, and we'll come back with Syed Hashimi in about an hour, I am told, from Gelman back there in the back. Yeah, we'll be back in about an hour, and we will see you here at Microsoft Virtual Academy.